Good evening and greetings to all viewers and listeners to ZIZ, wherever you may be in the world this evening. A very special welcome, of course, to those of you joining us on the World Wide Web. Just in case there are those of you who want to follow the live stream, you may find a link on ZIZ's Facebook page. You may also find a link to the live stream on the homepage of the Integrity Commission, www.iplskn.com. Later on in the program, we'll provide the opportunity for call-in, and I'll give you the numbers immediately, but of course I'll repeat them then. And so the local numbers would be 466-2666, 662-8674, 767-4765, and internationally you may call 1-239-645-4500, and we'll repeat those numbers a little later on. Again, welcome. Now, last December 9th, the United Nations marked International Anti-Corruption Day, as it does every 9th December. And in fact, that week concluded a 6-week campaign which started on 1st November and went on for the ensuing 6 weeks. The theme for the campaign was "Your Right, Your Role, Say No to Corruption." And it embodied a different focus each week, including education and youth, sport, gender, the private sector, even COVID-19, and international cooperation. Locally, the Integrity Commission held its very first panel discussion. It launched an essay competition, and just this month we were receiving the entries for that essay competition. And at that time, we also held talks in primary schools starting in November and going through to December. As a follow-up to those activities, the Commission has made presentations this year in all of the high schools in St. Kitts, as well as at the Clarence Fitzroy Bryant College. And now this evening we stage this panel discussion in what we hope will just be the first in a number of such events. Now, our panelists this evening, and I will begin right next to me, is Mr. Kevin Hope. Kevin is the Executive Director at the Chamber of Industry and Commerce. Good evening, Kevin. Next to him is Dr. Valda Henry, who is Deputy Governor at the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. Good evening, Dr. Henry.
Good evening, Mr.
Then Reverend Canon Dwayne Cassius, who is the Interim Coordinator at the St. Kitts Christian Council. Good evening, Reverend Cassius.
Good evening.
And finally, Mr. Garth Wilkin, who is presently the President of the St. Kitts Nevis Bar Association. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr.
Thank you, panelists, for joining us this evening, and let's have a really fruitful discussion. Now, in his 2018 anti-corruption address, so then it would have been 9th December 2018, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, "Corruption begets more corruption and fosters a corrosive culture of impunity." I'm going to say that again because it's a mouthful. Corruption begets more corruption and fosters a corrosive culture of impunity. I want us to begin by examining that statement. As I say, it's heavy. And so, tell me, from your point of view, definition sort of, when we say corruption, what are we talking about? I'll go to the furthest point first, Mr. Wilkin.
Use of power, typically public power, for personal gain. That is the fundamental definition of corruption.
Abuse of power.
Power. So you can have corruption in the corporate world, so it can be abuse of corporate power for personal gain. And you could have corruption in the public world, so abuse of public power for personal gain. For example, the typical example, a customs officer who signs off on import duties, who takes a bribe so that the person importing the goods can pay less duty. That is the standard act of corruption in a society.
Okay.
So that is in essence what it is. It typically involves bribery, but there are other forms of corruption as well.
Okay. Reverend Cassius?
Thank you. I very much agree with that. I want to put before us the whole notion of corruption as an attitude. Corruption as an attitude. And at least for me, that is where I really want to kick off my perspective on our discussion tonight. Speaking of corruption as an attitude, there are two fundamental things I would like for us to bear in mind. We talk about corruption in the sense of our actions, things we do or say. Okay, more so do. But then we also, in a very loud but sometimes unconscious way, we talk about corruption in terms of who we are, being, who an individual is, who a society is, what a group is. And so there are times when our discussion really focuses more on the who than the what. Sometimes it focuses more on the what than the who. But ultimately, if we are to think of corruption as an attitude, we would have to acknowledge that both dimensions come into play in a very serious way. Who we are and what we do. Yeah.
That's interesting. Before I go to Dr. Henry, I want to pick you up on that a little bit. Because when you say attitude, I mean, I think of attitude as a way of thinking. It's really internalized. It's your whole approach to life. That is what your attitude is. It's actions, to me, come even after. Actions reflect the attitude. So you're saying that corrosion is something that's deep-seated, living inside us?
I'm saying it can be. It can be. Okay, and so as you mentioned, our actions reflecting, our attitudes, who we are. But our actions are in some measure informed, as you were indicating, by the way we think, how our mindset is oriented. And just for example, it's very unfortunate that we live in a society, maybe I can say largely within the Western world, where when you talk about, and I trust our listening audience is not too sensitive, but when you talk about, for instance, a politician, there is a sense in which we talk about a person who is a politician as naturally being corrupt, or to naturally expect corruption because the person is a politician. Now, why should we think that to be a politician, a person has to be corrupt? But when we look at examples, when we look at, history and different things, for some strange reason, we seem to come to the conclusion that that is what politicians do. So very often, we use, sadly, our politicians in a very negative light at times. So we make certain jokes and what's not and so on. If a person is bad, you're going to be correct. Oh, you're a politician. That sort of a thing. So, so I think tonight, and I'm hoping that as we discuss, we would pay attention to the fact that we cannot separate our actions from ourselves, who we are and what we do. The two go together. And I think that's a very important understanding for us to keep in front of us as we continue the discussion.
Okay. Dr. Henry.
That's a very interesting perspective, but it ties in very well to a phrase, I don't know if it's a phrase, an epigraph that I coined while I was doing my research that says there is no good governance without men and women of integrity. And when we speak about who we are in terms of our attitude, that speaks about our whole personhood. And so it's really we who would take part in corrupt practices or who would encourage corrupt practices. And so it really comes back to the individual. And so oftentimes we talk about politicians, we talk about institutions that are corrupt, but institutions are made up of individuals. And it's the individuals and not the institution or the organization in and of itself that's corrupt. And if we take the statement that was made, that corruption begets more corruption and consequently it leads to a corrosive culture of impunity, and that's correct. Why? Because if I'm engaging in the correct practices, let's say in my institution, then what moral authority do I have when someone else does an act that is less corrupt than what I've just done? And it is the loss of moral authority that creates the corruption to continue to beget more corruption. And then once that happens, what happens? Impunity, because you know you cannot be held to account. So there's going to be no accountability, and it is that lack of accountability that creates that sense of impunity. And so persons sometimes almost feel that they're untouchable. And then we see more corruption until eventually, as the old saying in the Caribbean says, you give them so much rope until they then hang themselves with their own rope that they have created. But sometimes that rope is a very long rope. But but again, it always comes back to the individual.
You're scaring me already.
Really? Why am I scaring you, Mr. Knight? You can't be so easily scared.
Yeah, because again, just to go back to where we were. One thinks of corruption very often as you think of the acts, the acts that people do. Yeah. Okay? But what you're both saying here right away is that we're talking about us, the people themselves, already.
Because before you can do the act, you have to think it. And that is why we have to be careful of what we think.
But a lot of our anti-corruption efforts, and we're going to come on to those, but a lot of our anti-corruption efforts focus on the acts.
And maybe that's why they are not as successful.
It's not focusing on us. I mean, boy, we must have a lot of bad people out there in society.
This is why you have panel discussions like this, to get the public aware and to understand what corruption is, so they can look themselves in the mirror and decide if they're going to be a morally corrupt person or not. And that is why public awareness and public education is a very important role that the Commission has. Because you have to get people to look themselves in the mirror. Those people in the institutions, those people in the church, those people in the corporations. Right. To look themselves in the mirror and say, I know what corruption is. Am I going to be that type of person?
Just a quick thing. Michael Holding, almost every time he does an interview or something, Michael Holding has a pet phrase that he uses, and he says over and over and over, people keep blaming the system, and he says it's not the system, it's the people running the system. And it comes back to the same thing that we're talking about in terms of corruption. We blame institutions and organizations and the whole rest of it. But it's not just an institution, an organization doesn't just exist, in abstract. It is people. It's us, who make these things what they are. And hence, why I really would want us to keep those two bits together, who we are and what we do.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Hope from the...
I'm happy to add to this issue, because from where I sit, I see corruption as an outcome or a symptom of poor governance and poor leadership, right? And again, we come back to the human side or the human effect. When we think of governance, so it's important for us to recognize governance speaks to, again, the tradition, the institutions, the respect of our citizens for people in authority, and even the use, or even those in leadership, how they go about implementing. So when all of these moving parts fall short, this whole vicious cycle of corruption perpetuates. Yeah? So, even, yes, on one hand, we know of many instances in Africa, or even in a number of our small island developing states, where we may have individuals, or whether it be politicians and others, and their families who would amass great amount of wealth by just whether unauthorized or illegal acts, and accumulating this wealth. So, if we're going to tackle this culture, if we're going to tackle all of this impunity, we have to examine both the bottom up and top down. Yeah? And we, the people, have to be prepared to hold each other accountable. Yeah?
So yes, oftentimes we look at the politicians, we look at, say Africa and the countries where you see abject, the blatant corruption of what we know about the abuse of power. But I think we have to go a little bit inside. There are corrupt practices in our everyday life. And that is where we also have to begin to eradicate it, because if we allow it to fester in our children and in ourselves, and when they become adults, then that's what it leads to. So let me take as an example, after Hurricane Maria in Dominica, and there was widespread looting. And I got a little into trouble because I kind of spoke against it. And because at the time when I saw some people, I didn't even realize it's loot they were looting, to be honest, until I came to a store and I saw people.
And it's interesting, you got in trouble because you spoke against it.
Yeah, because, some people felt, I'll come back to that in a little while. And then, it was the who that you saw in the looting. People of high standing in the society. And one lady, I taught her, and she's now a teacher, one of our best teachers. And she started explaining, and I said, no, there's no need to explain. Because the question I then asked was, what lesson are we teaching our children? Because in that looting were not just parents who went on their own, it was like a family outing. So it was the parents with their children. And so if your child sees you looting, then are you going to tell them that they should not steal? Because what is looting? And then, I asked them a question beyond, in the sense that after, I don't know for other persons, but for me, after that Maria experience, one of the things, because while Maria was raging, and I'm telling you, I've been for a few hurricanes before, that Maria had to be absolutely the worst. All I could think was, at the end of the day, all of the physical and material possessions you had really would mean nothing if you lost your life. And then when you got up and you realized you were still alive, and yes, you had some missing roofs and so on, but most of your things were still in order. You then recognize that you could give away half of all that you had and not be any poorer for it, or even miss it. And then why no was that need to grab on and to pick? There's a psychological thing that I don't understand. But I think those things, our children come home with things that we know does not belong to them. We don't send them to bring it back. We don't make them bring it back. So it's all of those little things.
Well, again, as I said, you scare me because you give an example of a respected, respectable person in society and so on, ending up looting, it's almost like a family outing. It makes me wonder, again, back to you, Reverend Cassius, we're saying that that level of dishonesty, corruption is just part of our makeup fabric. The hurricane perhaps and the destruction gave it an opportunity to show its head, but we all just have that level of...
If I may, you see, we're talking about this culture, the culture of corruption. And if I were to build on what the sister was just sharing, coming out of the hurricane experience, now you can have a situation where looting has taken place. One person, at least for the time, is brought before the court for looting. And that person insists, that they should not be punished because look at all them other people who loot and they get away. So when we talk about a culture of corruption, and that's why I mentioned who we are, the way we think, the way our thinking is oriented. Now, if something is wrong, it's wrong. And if 20 people get away scot-free because for whatever reason, if I have done the same thing and I get caught, why should I make a case not to be punished just because 10, 20 or whatever number of people get away scot-free?
What about, and both Kevin and Gal, what about need? People will tell you need. While you were talking, I pulled up one of my favorite old-time calypsos, Sparrow. Honesty. Okay. Honesty is the best policy, but you don't refer that to people like me. Mm-hmm. Okay? Right. Rich people, they can do anything because they're living like queen and king. Whenever your neighbor living in luxury, the first man to tell you to be honest is he. Right? But honesty is for the rich, they can all live above board. But it's one virtue us poor people can't afford. Temptation always knocking at your door. Where the next meal coming from? Man, you're never sure. That is always the case when you're poor, so necessity knows no law.
Even if you go back to our older socialization, they were poor but honest. And sometimes poor persons treasured honesty. And that is one of the things they instilled in their children. And when you look at who got away with things, it wasn't the poor people. Even now, it's not the poor who really gets away with things. It's those who have access to money, to then who can defend themselves. It's not the poor who gets away with things. So the poor gets maybe punished even more for lesser offenses.
I'm happy you said that.
So it's not the poor at all. No, it's not the poor.
Kevin?
The poor is when you think about the poor gets punished even more for the slight thing. So a poor person will steal a tin of sardines in a supermarket. Let us say go back to say hungry. So they take a tin of sardines. They get punished severely, maybe a whole year or two or more in prison. White collar crimes, people steal millions of dollars. And because of that, they have money to find the best of lawyers. They fly them from all over the world. They get away scot-free. It's not that. But then, they get away. But what lessons have we sent to our children? What have we sent to our society? So we worry and we wonder and we say, well, how have we now become a society that is, accepting of corruption? How have we become a society where, it's all for each other and we can just grab and get for ourselves? It's things like that.
I would say that in a corrupt society, honesty is costly, right? In that, by you adhering to the guidelines, the rules, and the principles of ethical behavior and what it means to practice integrity, you tend to either be viewed as, or you may actually be aligned even if you blow the whistle. But of importance, because, for example, when you think of a corrupt society, let me just explore it a bit. We're thinking of situations where There may be short-term gains for, let's say, the private sector or entities or individuals who engage in, but it's actually taking away resources for the common good, for the people and for the country. Yeah? And you find instances in such a corrupt society, it's really the poor who are feeling the pinch, or there is no improvement in the social fabric. And then equally, if, let's say, the middle class or the poor, in some cases, were to speak up, he or she may likely lose their job, their opportunities to survive in society. So if we actually want to tackle, if we insist we're going to tackle corruption, as again, it has to be all-inclusive. It has to be a case where, civic society, the private sector, public sector, and a whole of society approach to say, listen, we're going to speak up against injustice. We're going to hold each other accountable. That whole practice of community that we had back in the days. And we're not going to condone corrupt practices. Regrettably, in our society, it's one of each person for themselves, and one for which it's about, about my household and what I can get. And again, that's the vicious cycle. So I'm interested in even learning and, listening to some of the inputs with respect to how we're going to tackle this elephant.
In fact, I think it was some time ago, we'll come to you, Gad, where I think it was Pope Francis who was agreeing that corruption is paid for by the poor. Yeah. Yeah, Gad?
It's impossible to function in a corrupt society as an honest person. Let me give you a practical example. When I went to UE, is when I discovered that in certain islands that will remain nameless, you can buy your driver's license. So in a corrupt society, and corruption is criminality, I think we have to recognize that. In a society that tolerates criminality in all aspects of its society, you as an honest person cannot function. In that society, you're not going to get your license unless you pay a bribe. In that society, you're not going to be able to have the police prosecute a criminal action against you because the gangster is bribing the police officer. So it's impossible to function as an honest person in a corrupt society. That is why it's important to have societal good governance. And it's important for us, we are the society, to decide, do we want to be a country that is focused on corruption or functions based on corruption and criminality, or one that functions on good governance and accountability and transparency? We have many examples in the world of both ends of that spectrum and how they function. And no corrupt society functions effectively because I believe that humans are innately good. I believe that our society can corrupt us to become bad and become criminals. But you cannot function as a good person, a moral person, in a society that has broken down and forgotten what good is and only believes that criminality is the way to go. To buy that driver's license is the way to go. To pay that police officer to look the other way is the way to go. To take a bribe from a politician to vote is the way to go. In that kind of society, I don't want to live in one of those. So if St. Kitts and Nevis becomes one of those, I love my country. Born here, I want to die here. But if it becomes one of those and it's slowly becoming one of those, I'm going to leave. I don't want to live in those kind of societies. Because decent people will not be able to function. I had friends from certain countries in Africa that I went to university with. When they tell me the stories, one just the other day, he lives in Belgium and he went home to Burundi. COVID test. He didn't do a COVID test. He paid a guy at just outside the airport to falsify a COVID test for him to go back to Belgium, and had COVID when he went back. I think he actually knew he might have had it. But that's how that society functions. A friend of mine, when we were leaving university, he was sending home a car because he was moving home. And he said, oh yeah man, I can just pay a little bribe and get that car in for basically nothing. In those societies, that's the only way you can function. The only way you get in a driver's license, the only way you get in like a alien land, a license, any kind of license in a government office, you're slipping under some money under the table. And that is when it gets widespread. And that is when you can't function as a society. And that is what that's impunity. Mm-hmm. People act with impunity. And then, so it's not just, so it's corruption in your society, and then it becomes criminality. Because everybody knows taking a bribe is a criminal act. And if everyone is doing it, everybody is acting like a criminal. And that's the only way that some people know how to function. And do you want to live in a lawless criminal society, Mr. Knight?
Yeah. Of course not. Dr. Henry?
And you're correct. When it gets to that extreme, it's like that. In fact, Gertrude Hofstede, a French researcher, psychologist, that's one of the things she argues. She said the corruption you see in the political life is a reflection of the society, because they didn't just get there. They came. They grew up. So it's a reflection of the what happens in society. But even in a corrupt world, good people can still exist. They must still exist. But I go back to the examples you use, and it goes back to the statement I make, that it comes back to the men and women of integrity. While yes, you could pay for it, he chose to pay for it because he could have gone to the legitimate places to get that test. So it's not the system is corrupt, but he too is corrupt, because he is the one who took advantage or who played into that. And once we keep playing into that, what happens? We are the ones who perpetuate this thing. And so again, the system in and of itself is not flawed. It's individual.
But still, I wondered. So how much power do we have against it? I recall. I think Dr. Henry, you and I may have discussed it a little bit some time ago, where I referred to the notion, for instance. I mean, we talk about many countries around the world, in Africa and so on, but you know that it is alleged, almost accepted, that many of the multinationals setting up shop around the world put in their accounts a 5% or so someplace for expenditure, for palming and greasing and so on. This is the expected way of doing business?
Actually, that is even becoming a little less to some extent, because if you go back, when you did your studies, you would have seen all of the cases that we would have done where it was expected that like 5% is small, it's like 20-25% that they expected, depending on the region where they went. And that was part of the expense of doing business. However, because of, again, the greater focus on good governance, and some of these very big firms have been fined for paying the bribe, we now see to some extent a kind of a lessening of that. But it still happens, and maybe still happens in big ways. But you then see, at least they don't show it on the books anymore, you then see a lessening of that. And again, maybe you ask yourself, maybe is it the cat before the horse or the horse before the cat? Because if you don't pay it, you may never get it. And does it mean that you then decide that I am going to go to another country where I don't have to pay those things? So again, to a large extent is societal, but to also what drives that society are the individuals. It's us.
I think the practice is also sort of move beyond just greasing the palms to contributing to the non-government organization, the gifts, the expensive plane tickets, or a ride in a private jet to some exotic place. Yep. So it just become more sophisticated, right? And while on one hand, again, one go argue it's the cost of doing business. Again, I spoke earlier about the cost of honesty. So we do have a choice, but we're going to have to choose that, listen, there are procedures for license. There are procedures to go about the process of getting an approval for land development. it may take more time because in a corrupt society, you sort of introduce even more bureaucracy, a number of unnecessary steps. Because again, if I'm a public official, it's beneficial for me to frustrate you, because there's a financial reward, right? So when we're speaking about why sometimes as a country we're unable to attract the type of financing and investment, it's for these said reasons. Yeah.
Okay. I want to move on. So we've touched a little bit on some of them, but in your experiences, sort of in our area, neck of the woods, neck of the world, that's not just St. Kitts Nevis, but maybe the region, what you see as the sort of most common forms of corruption around us that we experience? Political.
It's in our face. In our faces. To be elected into office is like a popularity contest. You have your constituents, you want to get the most votes. Right? Voting has now become transactional. That's a very perfect word. To get the most votes, it's easier to do it if you give a gift or you give money rather than convince the voters that you're the best person for the role to represent them. So how do you get the money? You get the money from the persons who have the money. The persons who have the money are not giving you the money unless they're going to get something in return. So I think in our society, at least from my perspective, what I see is an issue of who pays the piper. And it stems from that you need that money to win easily. Once you have that war chest, you are more likely to win power than without it, because voting is transactional in our society. So then it's a circle. If voting is transactional, you need money to get votes. You need money from somewhere. When you get that money from somewhere, that person wants something back. Likely it's going to be a contract. And it goes the other way as well. If you give the contractor the contractor is for $1 million, the contractor gives you $200,000. You can then use that $100,000 for your own personal enrichment, and then $100,000 for your campaign to get back in power to continue to give that contractor the jobs. It's a cycle. That is what I see as the most blatant corruption in our society.
Reverend Cassius, there have been quite a number of incidents, I would dare say scandals, from time to time about the church and corruption in the church. In our neck of the woods, have we any evidence of a lot of that?
Well, I'm sorry you beat me to the punch.
Okay.
Because I was going to ask the question, is the church corrupt? No. I would not accept that the church is corrupt. I would readily accept that there are some church leaders and church members who behave corruptly. But according to God's word that I firmly believe in, the church is the body of Christ.
Church is
and
the
I accept that. Okay? So you have persons in the church who behave badly, behave corruptly, give the church a bad name. But the church, essentially at its very core, is a good organization, it's a good thing, it's a good movement. But where I wanted to go as well, though, in the whole understanding, why do we do it? Why do we behave corruptly? Why? I had a conversation with a retired police officer a few years ago, and he said to me, Rev, we were talking about something similar in terms of bad behavior and all the rest of it. And he said, Rev, let me tell you, there's only one reason why people do these things. They are sure, or they have somehow convinced themselves that they will get away. He says, anyhow, I go and steal something, and I know for a fact that I go in jail tomorrow, I will never touch it. And he says the only reason, and this is a chap who has been a police officer all his life. I think he told me he went into training school from age 19 or something like that. Fresh out of school, always wanting to be a police officer. And he's saying out of his experience and all the cases he's worked in and all the different things, he has come to that conclusion. And I'm inclined to agree with him. People are convinced, or at least they have convinced themselves that they are going to get away, so they do it.
Well, it's interesting that they've convinced themselves that. Is it because they perceive that the organs and instruments of prevention and deterrence and so on are really weak and ineffective? Or is it because they've convinced themselves, as you scared me earlier, by thinking that we know everybody is in there corrupt anyhow. So they ain't gonna catch me.
But let me add this because it's important. Culture in a country, in the workplace, within any context, culture is largely determined by those at the top. And that's reality, that's life. In the church, in government, in businesses, in our homes, in school, whichever environment you want to choose, whatever context, the culture within that context is largely, and I say largely as in 90% of the culture is determined by the top.
Okay, so I'm going to come back. I'm going to take a break, and we're going to come back, and we're going to go on to talk now in terms. We're going to begin to talk about. So what can we do about some of this?
All right.
And once we come back, I'm going to invite the general public. If you have any input, if you have questions, remember that the numbers to call, I'm going to get them for you, 466-2666, 767-4765, 662-8674, and internationally it's 1-239-645-4500. We'll be right back.
This evening newscast will let you know what's happening in your community.
It's only just a phase. Once we're vaccinated, and everybody gon' be safe. Everybody gon' be safe. One kind, one people. We are roll up to roll up. Cause no man's alone. Do what's right. Cause I love you. Brother, my sister. And we're in this together. My sister, my brother. I don't wanna lose you. I love you too much. I think it's better for us, yeah. It's better for us, yeah. I don't wanna lose you. I love you too much, yeah. It's better for us. Tell your mommy to roll out.
Bless up. Dejo here, and I'm doing my part in the fight against COVID-19 by following all safety protocols and, most importantly, rolling up my sleeve for the vaccine. So I'm encouraging you to do the same because that's our best shot of protecting ourselves, our family, and our friends. So don't wait, vaccinate. Let's roll up to roll out.
Welcome back. So, we're going to move on a little bit. And I'm going to start by saying that one of the things I think is a reality is that corruption stares all of us in the face. You know, no one is excluded, whether it be kids in school, bullying, cheating on an exam, etc., etc. I gave some students the example here the other day, myself, of having traveled to a nearby island some years ago, quite a number of years ago, in fact, and having bought some appliances and going to ship them home, the business owner said, well, here are the invoices, plural. And I thought I was going to get an invoice for the items. But instead he gave me 2 invoices for the items. He said to me, this one is for you, and this one is for the customs. Okay? No, I did not. Quite shocking. He said, this one is for you, and this one is for the customs. And so this was, it kind of stares you in the face. It's all there. So I'm going to ask you, so what do we have in our toolkit? What do we have in our toolkit to fight against corruption? From our perspective, of course, at the Integrity Commission, you know, that legislation was passed a number of years ago. It was operationalized a few years now, and we are still, in fact, waiting still for certain elements of it to be done for us to become fully, really functional. But apart from that, I remember at one time there used to be an office of the Ombudsman, but that seemed to be just a sign on a door. We didn't really see very much coming out of that office. What tools do we have in our toolkit?
I want to say primarily we have the tool of choice. We have the tool of choice. And as difficult as some cultures may be, whether we're talking nationally, in the workplace, home, the community, whatever, as difficult as some cultures may be, we always, and I want to emphasize always, have the tool of choice. Yes, it may not be easy, it may not be sweet, but nonetheless, we have that choice. And I want to just share, I mean, I'm sure you'll understand if I read from the Bible. I wanted to share this with us. I'm sure you're familiar with it. But in this instance, and this is from Matthew's Gospel, chapter 15, when Jesus is questioned about why his disciples are eating with unwashed hands. A very sort of a trivial matter, we would say, and they make a big deal out of it. But the response, here's the response. Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this is what defiles. For out of the heart come evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But we understand as well, excuse me, that out of the heart, while these bad things can come out of the heart can also come truth, honesty, love, goodness, and the whole, the whole list of it. And so what that says to us then, as I just said earlier, we have a choice. And if people don't think, if people don't believe, if people don't know, if people are not convinced that they have a choice, then, the battle is pretty much almost lost. So I believe one of the things and the messages that we need to get across to individuals is helping them to know and understand that they have
that choice. That choice, as you describe it, would then be all tied up in faith and belief and all of that. Yes?
Yes, and maybe I can say no to a little extent. Let me introduce this, because I know they are persons of all persuasions. Now, even for a person who is a non-Christian, and if I go even further, let's say an atheist, someone who does not believe in God, that there is a God, that a God exists. I have a friend, a school friend. We all went away to study. We all went to different places. And she returned home some years ago, and we are, catching up. And this was one of her experiences that she recounted. In university, she ended up in a room, in a dorm. And she was there with 2 other religious persons and an atheist. And over the course of her first year, who do you think became not so much her best friend, but who do you think she got along better with out of the 3? There were 2 other religious persons and an atheist and herself. And the atheist, she said, and she said, she was so surprised, but she found the young lady who was an atheist, they got along very well. And she said the young lady never pressured her about her faith, not to believe in God or anything like that. And she said they just connected, they got along well. So I am saying that even for persons who do not believe in God, I've had my personal experience working with an atheist. Very, very sound gentleman. Very honest, very upright. And again, I say, we have a choice.
Okay, Garth, legally, what do we have in our toolkit?
What we colloquially call here is good governance legislation. So, the integrity in public life legislation, freedom of information legislation, procurement and contracts legislation, campaign financing legislation. Those are all good governance statutes that help to prevent or at least criminalize certain corrupt acts. And generally relates to the public service and politicians and so forth.
Are they adequate?
If they're done properly. You give the example. In the main act in St. Kitts, Integrity in Public Life, was passed in 2013. Came into force in 2018. Has a politician or senior civil servant submitted a declaration of their assets and liabilities yet?
No, because we haven't been able to ask them to.
You think they want to monitor themselves? You think they want the Integrity Commission to see it? So it's just typical politicking. They say they've done it so they could check off a list on the manifesto, and they don't really care about implementing it. So if it's implemented properly, for example, that legislation, every senior civil servant, every minister declares their assets every year. And if something looks strange next year, Mr. Knight and his colleagues can then say something seems strange. You're making $10,000 a month, but your assets have increased by $200,000. What is that about? I don't see a loan from a bank, right? If that is implemented properly, then you have those checks and balances against corruption. If you have freedom of information, you get to see who a contract was given to, how much it was for. It then protects whistleblowers. I heard Kevin talk about whistleblowers earlier, persons who speak out on corruption in government offices and so forth. So if they are implemented properly and they have all of the regulations that are required for them to function, then they are a good buffer against corruption.
Okay. Dr. Henry, from the sort of aspect of the central bank overlooking our financial systems and so on, what sort of tools you see we have in our toolkit?
I just want to just make one quick addition, because
sure, no problem.
the comment I made earlier, when I talk about choice, I don't want to just leave it hanging like that. I want it to be understood that when I talk about us having a choice, we understand that that choice I'm talking about is what God has given to us. I don't want it to come across as, just something that we do, but to understand that this thing that we call choice, and that we sometimes take for granted, it is actually a divine given
that's why
gift.
I said it would actually be tied up in,
so I just
in
want
your
to
faith
make,
and all of
make,
that.
make, make
right.
that point, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so, yeah, Dr. Henry has...
Is he saying something? Oh,
There's a call? Yes, good evening. Good evening, caller.
Yes, good evening. Very good panel, and good night to all of you there. Great program. I hope that this can be rebroadcast, because it's very, very educational, especially to young people.
If we can get you a little bit more clearly, the television is really just so loud that everything is echoing. We can't
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
All right. Can you try that again, caller?
Okay. Is it better?
Yes, that is much better. Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, so good night, and I wanted to good night to the panelists. Great program, and I hope that this can be rebroadcast, because it is very educational, very, very educational, especially for young people who are coming up and you're speaking about corruption and how to avoid them from getting into corruption. But the other thing that was said, and I want to ask you a question. Now, during a campaign, an elected member will go on asking for your vote. Now, if I ask them for help and they give me, is that bribery for vote? Would that be classed as corruption? Now, also, no one wants to get caught. So, if I have money and I gotta pay a lawyer because I want to get off scot-free, that's the way the system works. But I would agree in the sense that I should own up to my responsibility. However, I can ask my lawyer to plead for leniency for me. So yes, I might fly in a lawyer from overseas who I know is much more better. Is that corruption? Because I have the money to get a good lawyer who can get me a lesser sentence. Because I listen to a lot of what you all are saying, and I know where you all is going. But at the same time, we are human beings. I'm listening to the pastor. But accepting responsibility is where you have to start first. That's why I say, I hope that this can be a broadcast for children, teenagers, can know that at an early age that we have to take responsibility. But when power and money get to us, it changes, So good night. I'll continue listening.
We're going to try to discuss your matter. Okay. So his first concern was whether or not there's a politician, and leave the second one. There's a politician running for office, and he asks for help. Is he sort of inducing there some kind of bribery, some sort of corruption there?
Did he ask for help in exchange for a vote? Or if you help me, then I'll vote for you. If that is what he's doing, then that is where you call the bribery, and then that is where the corruption. But if it's altruistic help that a person has given you because you need you got it, or you got the help with the understanding that you don't have to vote for me, or there is no such understanding, then that can't necessarily be corruption. So it has to be there, because in order for it to be corruption, it has to be an abuse of a power. You understand? And if I've helped you without an expectation of anything, then that cannot be corruption. I've just helped you because I maybe had the means and you had the need. So so there has to be that, I think. Okay,
and then the second point, I think Mr. Wilkin was talking something like that earlier. He was saying, suppose does something, and he wants to get off. So he asks his lawyer to plead for leniency, or he just has the money to be able to get a good lawyer and get him off, if that would be considered corruption.
Well, I think when we said that, I think it's in the context. I think I was the one who, when I was saying that, you know, poor persons are the ones who feel the brunt of those things. If you have your money and your legitimate good money you've earned, and you find yourself into some trouble, and maybe we should take responsibility, but we know that's why lawyers are here, and you're able to afford your lawyer, I don't think anybody can say that is corrupt. But what we are saying is that a person now with less means may commit something so much, you know, minor offense, but because they don't have the means
to get the full weight,
it's not that it's corruption, but the system sometimes, the overall system sometimes gets stacked against the poor.
Okay, Mr. Dyte, sorry, in relation to the first part of the question, I was looking it up. There's actually an offense under the Integrity and Public Life Act under the Abuse of Office section that says a public official commits an offense of abuse of office if he or she uses public funds or resources for private purposes, including party political purposes.
So if you are public funds
or resources, so it could possibly be if you are giving someone preference for a public home, so that that person votes for you or donates to your party or something, it could potentially fall under that section. It's very widely worded, but you know,
but it wouldn't be a situation where there is somebody who genuinely,
yes, of course,
needs a home, needs a house, and goes to politicians and say, look, man, I really need something, I need help, and that person assists them.
If the politician then says, okay, well,
here's how to go about it.
And that is where the corruption is.
Right.
So there must be a process for which someone don't gain an unfair advantage.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's important as well to say just quickly that our people have to understand that this is the reason why we elect persons to represent us. And so a politician is not necessarily doing you a favor because they help you to get a scholarship or you get a house. You know, like you said, if there's a process that's being properly followed.
That's right, it's their job.
It's their job, right. So if you're following a process properly, you know, I get a scholarship. I don't owe you anything. That is your work. That's what you've been elected for. Okay, so once you follow the process properly, you get a scholarship, you get a house, you get whatever. Once it's been following through a proper process, when I get whatever I get, I don't have to feel obligated to you. You've been elected to do a job.
And perhaps, again, not just the general public should understand that, the politicians should understand
right, they're doing their work.
As well. There was a second call. Is it still there? Can we have it now?
Good evening.
Good evening.
To you and your panel. The Singapore example has been overused to the point of being a cliche now. But as a practical example, isn't their kind of zero tolerance to corruption is what is needed here? And do we need to rethink this idea that people are innately good when in fact they are innately selfish, and therefore they need strictures to be put in place to save them not only from abuse from powerful persons, but to save them from themselves, because corruption is very corrosive. And integrity has been defined as doing the right thing when nobody is looking. And so doesn't it behove all of us to look, right? Trust but verify. And finally, I'm not sure if any of the panelists can answer this, but I would like to know what triggers an investigation, let's say by the Integrity Commission. Is it there just to review declarations, or if something happens, can they investigate on their, can they launch investigations on their own, or can they look at complaints from any citizen as to what they perceive as corruption and investigate it? Thanks.
Thanks very much, caller. Anybody want to comment? Well, let's go to the Singapore question first, and then I'll go to the. Yeah, he was saying the very stringent model of the Singapore model. He said, isn't that the kind of thing that's needed here?
I saw a video on my WhatsApp a couple weeks ago from, I think it was an elderly Singapore businessman. And he said in the video, and I'll paraphrase, they had after they passed their laws, they had one politician who took a bribe. And he was locked up. And after that, nobody took bribes. Because everybody saw that a politician, imagine St. Kitts and Nevis if a politician went to jail for taking a bribe or some form of corruption. You know, and that's what happened in Singapore. That is how they got their zero tolerance to actually function. Because yes, you can have the laws, but until it's effected and somebody actually is caught and punished, you know, we're the type of people like them. We respond to actually seeing something done, not necessarily black and white on a statute sheet.
But it's also important to reinforce the point that, again, corruption is an outcome. So if we really want to arrive at zero tolerance for corruption, we have to be emphasizing and focusing on improving governance and even the type of people we prepare as a populace to elect into government. All right? So I mean, all these things are connected. Yeah?
Well, I think where it starts at, before I answer the ECCB, I think it starts at the values that we teach. That's where it stems from, is what are the values that we teach. You know, we teach our children, is the socialization starts from the home, and then it goes forth. And you know, it kind of brings me back to Luke 16:10, because if you cannot be trusted in small things, you can't be trusted in big things. You know, and so that is where we have to begin to teach. Because if our children can hold $2 and they're taking, and we know they're taking the dollar, and we keep casting a blind eye, when they get to a place where now they find millions. And they're like, what? Millions available and have need? They find it. And there's something I say to my son almost every day, you know. And it's because, you know, you're just trying to get that message in. And he thinks I talk too much, so he does that sometimes to me, you know, like a broken record. But I really say it almost every day. I have it in his room. I bought this thing. Watch your thoughts, because they become your words, huh? Watch your words, they become your action. Watch your actions, they become your habits. Watch your habits, they become your character. And watch your character, because it becomes your destiny. And it has to, that is where we have to start. Because it's our values that hold us. That in the face of temptation, in the face of trials, because we've all been find situations where we've been tested, but what holds you is the values that you have and how you hold that. And you know, I've said it oftentimes before, because my father, when we were growing up, you know, I loved dancing. And in my village, every Sunday, there would be a dance party, 2:30 to 6 o'clock, 25 cents to get in. And every Sunday, my father would give me $1. And every Sunday, I got that same speech. He would say to me, Valda, here's $1. 25 cents to go in. That's what you say, right? So that means you have 75 cents change. He said, what do they sell there? I said, well, there's juice and sandwiches. And so he said, good, what's the price? Everything was 25 cents at that. He said, good. So you can get yourself one juice, one sandwich, one cake. You can have 2 juices, 1 cake. And he begins to give me the various options. You can give a person a drink, give yourself 2, whatever it is. So you have enough to not go and ask. And he used to say to me every time before I left that house, Valda, I trust you. Now you go out and trust yourself. To this day, at my very big old age, I still remember that. He used to also say to us that our name was borrowed. He lent it to us. And so we should do nothing to bring his good name in disrepute.
It sounds like the House of Singapore.
You understand? so that's where it starts.
Right.
And that's what holds us when we go into this big wide world full of all temptations, you know. And then respect for people, respect for self, and respect for others. That's a fundamental thing too. Because if we respect people, there are certain things we just will not do. If we respect ourselves, there are certain things we also will not do. So those are some, you know, it sounds old-fashioned, but I'm telling you, those are the things that we need to combat some of that.
Okay, let me answer the second part of that question, which talked about how the Commission will be motivated to action. So I'm going to read from Section 18 in the legislation. Functions of the Commission. Commission shall A, receive, examine, and retain all declarations filed pursuant to the provisions of the Act. B, make such inquiries as it considers necessary in order to verify or determine the accuracy of any declarations. C, without prejudice to the provisions of any other enactment, conduct an investigation into any allegation of bribery or act of corruption under the Act referred to it by any person. All right, so let me read that again. Without prejudice to the provisions of any other enactment, conduct an investigation into any allegation of bribery or act or corruption under this Act referred to it by any person. Okay, so that I think goes to the question. All right, let's there's a caller. We're going to take that call, and then Dr. Henry, we're going to come back. Forgotten you. We're going to come back to the central bank, the ECCB, and what you see as the tools in the toolkit. Let's take the call. Good evening, caller.
Yes. Good night. How are you all doing?
Wonderful. Thank you.
Good. I like this panel discussion. Very timely in the sense it's educational and informative in society. Integrity of public life, even though something has been passed so many years and they haven't implemented it. The people in authority is remembering the former Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago. And I'll keep it there. However, I would like to stress on two things based on my experiences. One time I was a former restaurant manager. And I would buy from the local farmers because those are the ones that patronized the restaurant I used to manage. They bought some produce which I paid for. But when I left, they returned and brought something else which I didn't ask for, but was for me. However, I do not accept gifts on any job of anything that I buy for any establishment. So I did say to him, anything you bring from your farm for me cannot be brought here. It must be taken home where I live. And that's a former teacher who taught me in high school. He looked at me and smiled. However, I once drove a man who was here for a financial
caller. I'm going to thank you for calling. We're having difficulty following you because you're cutting in and out. At times we aren't hearing you for 5, 6, 7, 8 seconds. And so it's difficult sort of understanding what your contribution is or what the question is. So let's move on. Perhaps if you call back, and then we'll be able to take you. Dr. Henry, we're talking about what is it from the central bank point of view? What do we have?
Well, from the ECCB point of view, we have various legislative frameworks in place. So there are the prudential guidelines for the commercial sector, the licensed financial institutions, but also too you have bigger legislation. Like yes, the CCB agreement, but we have the Bankers Act, we have the the harmonization of the Banking Act across the region. We have the movement now into the payment systems to regulate, and so the main focus is on the regulation of the financial space to keep it safe, to keep it sound. But you also have, in terms of the moral authority that the central bank has to have as the body that monitors the financial space, our monetary council. So I think what we do generally is just foster the whole thing of good governance. Mm-hmm. That is the central thrust of ECCB. And if you look at even the institutions that ECCB has put in place, it is all meant to foster that. When we look at the ECSRC, the Eastern Caribbean the Stock Regulation Commission, we look at the ECSC, the Eastern Caribbean Stock Exchange. Recently, as a response to COVID also, but is also to provide a framework and a better framework for the small business sector in terms of the partial credit guarantee corporation. So ECCB itself has its whole focus is on good governance, because good governance and confidence in the ECCB is critical to achieve our goal, which is the transformation of the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union. And as Governor Antoine likes to say, so that our people are not just striving, they are thriving. And we cannot achieve a transformation if there isn't good governance.
One question I must ask, and I'll move quickly on to Kevin, is that right now with the war we see in Ukraine, allegedly there's going to be a lot of illicit money on the move. Are we in danger in our jurisdiction?
Well, we have very strict AML guidelines and rules. So I'm not sure if this money that's on the move will find a safe place here in our region, because they have some very strict AML rules, and the bank is really keen on monitoring that. And not only the bank, you also have in the spaces, and in fact just today I chaired on behalf of Governor the regulatory oversight committees meeting, where in each of the territories we have the single regulatory units that do that monitoring. ECCB brings all of them together in terms of a coordinating view, and that was one of the things that came up in terms of even a response. So some of the actions that the OECD came up with, and what was the response that the countries had to do in order to fit in. So I'm not sure how much of that money will find its way there. Mm-hmm. I cannot tell you zero will find its way, because there's a will, there may be a way. But I will say to you, the ECCB has put in place enough stringent measures that should prevent these loose monies
from just
to just show up in our space.
Okay, I think there are caller on the line, so let's take that. We're gonna come then to Kevin, and then we're gonna start wrapping. So let's get the caller. Good evening. We're hardly hearing.
Yes, I'm saying good evening.
Still can't hear you.
Hello.
All right, that's better.
Hello.
Yes, that's better. Can hear you now.
Good evening. Does the existence of an Integrity in Public Life Act presume the existence of corruption, and it is there to deter public officials from corruption? And if so, do we also need an Integrity in Private Life Act?
Thank you, caller.
Yeah.
Right. The Integrity in Public Life Act, I think, is one of, again, I was using what tools do we have in our toolkit. So I think it's one of the good governance tools. It does not necessarily assume that, well, there is corruption, although I'm not saying that there isn't, or does it just is not necessarily assume there's rampant corruption. But I think it is seen as one of the useful tools, because I don't think it can operate by itself. One of the useful tools in the good governance toolkit of any government. Need for an integrity in private life act. That's an interesting concept. Any of the panelists?
We have lots of criminal laws.
Okay. All right. So that would satisfy.
Criminal laws
that,
cover most of the potential
the
human
private
frailties. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
Where we have to declare use of source of funds. But interestingly, the integrity in public life, when you think of it, I know oftentimes we tend to only think of the public sector, and the call is right in that the public sector is the perpetrator of corruption. But the private sector is not only the victim, but also in many cases initiate. Yeah? So in some cases, he's right. I guess the integrity in public life at least capture one aspect of it. I think one of the contributions we are looking at and we already initiating is to sign on to the United Nations Global Compact, which Principle 10 speaks about businesses should work against corruption in all forms, including extortion and bribery. And within this year, we've been engaging our local UN counterpart, for which we as a chamber intend to spearhead and to encourage all of our members to adhere to these principles as a way of complementing the work of the Office of the Integrity Commission. In a former life, also in banking, we've had the practice in banking, and again, we can promote this within the private sector when we talk about ensuring that there are proper internal audit and compliance controls. Also in banking, you have a situation where you have to have annual mandatory integrity training. Similarly, for those of us who sits on board or spearhead or lead companies, there is also training and the promotion of good corporate governance. So you find, even though we in St. Kitts and Nevis have a lot of micro and small medium enterprises, again, as a chamber, here is an opportunity where we can show leadership and collaborate with different agencies to promote good governance, to promote leadership, to promote good corporate governance, and all of these things that would sort of engender change in that culture that we spoke about tonight.
Okay.
In terms of even ECCB, how could I have forgotten the inspection that ECCB does of the banks, and of the other things. So that's
okay. As I look back then, and we've touched, or we've probably just scratched the surface, haven't we? for the evening, but there's some what I would consider to be some basic prerequisites if we're going to be able to battle corruption. One of them is that we must have more connectivity, coordination in our systems, both private and public. I tend to feel that when an office tends to work on its own, there is a greater likeliness for corruption. All right. I remember, for instance, the public's concern when we were hearing some years ago that it seems like the SIDF is somehow independent. You remember that period? And we were all worried. We would have all wanted it to be part of the thing, and so there could be greater accountability and so on. So I don't know if you agree with me. I would like to see a lot more of that. There's a certain level of openness and transparency. I don't know if you think we have enough of that. Our society is so closed, and so that even sometimes very basic information that we need to run our organizations, we go to certain government offices and you just can't access the information. Sometimes the information is there, and the clerks and so on wondering whether or not they can give it they can give it to you. how do you feel about these guys? You feel in it. Kevin, you talked, for instance, about, you mentioned the word whistleblower, Garth did. Sometimes you see the need for this sort of thing, more transparency, perhaps some sort of whistleblowing legislation function somewhere like that?
I'll give an example. So I spent a lot of time in Barbados, in Trinidad, both work, study, growing up and stuff. And in St. Kitts, even in preparing for tonight's event, you would think that if you go to Transparency International, which have their corruption index, you would be able to at least get some data points, some information. But this is non-existent, right? So when you speak about a sort of being a closed society, even in terms of reporting or even having the confidence to speak about our perception, but it's real, it's felt. I mean, day to day, we face or we hear incidences of where there is corruption. Yeah? So, I say it to say, and similar to when the caller spoke about the private sector, in a sense, in terms of private, I don't believe there is a need for more legislation at the moment. It's important for us to actually implement and operationalize what exists. And as you said, as we're having here tonight, a greater connection in terms of public, private, civic society, faith-based. In instances when we have a crisis, historically we come together, we advocate, and there is change. So I think tonight is an example of such, and we can't just wait until it's December to sort of just start talking about corruption, but we need to collaborate and have a program, and we actually all contribute to that toolkit. And for potentially even advocate and collaborate to have a local chapter with Transparency International. So let us, because it's regrettable. I mean, I empathize with sometimes the clerks and officials within government who may be fearful because of fear that they may lose their job. When this administrative data and other stuff can enable and engender greater governance and even the kind of policies we need to grow our country. So again, I'm looking forward to that engagement.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And my last pet peeve I'd like to put out there is the absence of a really good press.
I am a director of another media organization who considers itself to be very independent, and that is what our goal is. We have a variety of directors, no single owner, and it was set up by civic persons, minded persons who wanted a media enterprise to challenge. We have been successful in some ways, not successful in others. But we have a Freedom of Information Act that was passed in 2018, not operationalized. That would help the press to do their job. If you can, this is done in a lot of the other islands. A request for information is submitted to a particular government office and you get the information. If you don't get it, you go to court and you get it. So our press, and I can tell you that from being on a board of a media enterprise, sometimes it's very difficult to get information from public offices. Yeah, so that's why you need a legislative framework.
Yeah, and I think the press, the medium does play an important part. First of all, just awareness, education, and then we get to the areas of things like accountability. We can hold private and public, not just public, private and public, in individuals accountable if we had a really good, strong media and press. All right, so that was my last pet peeve. So, panelists, this has been good. And I think just the start of many to come. I'm going to thank you so very much for your input. And I hope that the public out there really learned, really enjoyed, and in some way we made you a lot more aware about corruption in society as in general, and the need for your individual integrity. As the saying goes, from the United Nations campaign. It's your right, your role. Say no to corruption. Good evening.